The morning Ellen Rourke found the deed to her family's land sitting on the kitchen table with her name written across the top in a stranger's careful hand. She sat down hard in her father's old chair and did not stand again for a very long time. But that moment came later, and to understand it, you had to go back to the dust and the heartbreak that came before it. Ellen Rourke was 22 years old in the autumn of 1878, living in a two-room house on the eastern edge of Colfax County, New Mexico Territory, with nothing left to her name but a mule named Biscuit, a broken fence line, and a grief so heavy it pressed against her ribs every time she drew breath. Her father, Thomas Rourke, had died 6 weeks prior, leaving behind a plot of land he had worked for 11 years, and a debt he had hidden from his daughter with the same stubborn pride that had defined every hour of his life. The land was gone before Ellen had even finished burying him. Hector Crane, the man who held the note on the property, had come to the door with a sheriff's deputy on the very morning after the funeral, and he had not been unkind about it in the way that men sometimes pretend gentleness when they are taking something from you. He had been perfectly businesslike, which was somehow worse. "The debt is recorded and the note is due," Crane had told her, his hat in his hands, his eyes sliding past her face to the fields beyond. "The land transfers Monday morning. You can stay in the house through the end of the week." She had not begged. Thomas Rourke had raised her not to beg. But the look she had given Hector Crane was one she suspected he still thought about on quiet nights, because it was the look of a woman who was burning every detail of the injustice into her memory, with the intention of carrying it forever. So when Monday came, she took Biscuit and the things she could carry in 2 flour sacks and walked 3 miles east to the town of Red Mesa, where she took a room above the dry goods store, owned by a widow named Mrs. Clara Finch. She cleaned the store each morning in exchange for the room and ate sparingly, and worked her mind constantly on the problem of what came next. She was not a woman given to self-pity. But she was also not a woman who had any idea how to get back what had been taken from her, and that helplessness was its own particular kind of agony. Red Mesa was not a large town. It had one main street with a saloon at each end, a livery stable, a church, a barber, a telegraph office, and a jail that saw regular use. The Santa Fe Ring, which was what people called the network of land speculators and lawyers and corrupt officials who had been gobbling up property throughout New Mexico Territory for years, had their fingers in nearly every transaction of consequence in Colfax County. Hector Crane was not the most powerful man in that network, but he was a reliable servant of it, and he had accumulated several thousand acres through the same method he had used on Thomas Rourke, buying up debt notes quietly and then calling them due at the worst possible moment for the people who owed them. Ellen understood all of this clearly by the time she had been in Red Mesa for 3 weeks. She understood it because she listened carefully to every conversation in the dry goods store, and because she had read every letter and document her father had left behind until she knew their contents the way she knew the Lord's Prayer. Understanding it did not help her. But it gave the grief somewhere to go, and anger was a cleaner fuel than sorrow. It was on a Tuesday in late October that Louis Sullivan first walked through the door of Finch's Dry Goods. He was not what you would call a dramatic entrance. He was a tall man, lean through the shoulders in the way that men who work with their bodies tend to be, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He wore a working cowboy's clothes, canvas trousers, a faded blue shirt, boots that had been resoled at least twice. He had a hat that had been through serious weather and a Colt revolver on his hip that he wore with the easy unself-consciousness of a man who had carried one for a long time and had stopped thinking about it. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark eyes that moved around a room in the calm, assessing way of someone who had learned through experience to know who was in a room before committing to being in it. He was buying flour and coffee and a length of cotton rope, and he set his items on the counter and waited patiently while Ellen tallied them up. He was polite without being ingratiating, paid with exact coins, and said thank you in a voice that was quiet but not soft, and then he turned to go. He stopped at the door. "Pardon me," he said. "Are you Miss Rourke, Thomas Rourke's daughter?" Ellen went very still. "I am," she said carefully. He turned back to face her. Something in his expression shifted slightly, though she could not have named what it was. "My name is Louis Sullivan. I rode with your father for 2 seasons on the Goodnight Trail back in '72 and '73. He was a good man. I was sorry to hear he passed." Ellen looked at him for a long moment. "You knew my father?" "I did. He talked about you often. Said you were the sharpest mind in Colfax County and that you could fix a fence line faster than any hand he'd ever hired." A slight pause. "He wasn't wrong about the sharp part, I imagine." Despite herself, despite the weight she was carrying, something small and warm moved through Ellen's chest. "He exaggerated," she said. "Cattlemen usually do," Louis said. Then he put his hat back on and walked out into the bright New Mexico morning, and Ellen stood looking at the closed door for considerably longer than made practical sense. He came back to the store 3 days later for tobacco and lamp oil. He was brief and polite again, but as he turned to leave he paused and said, "If you ever want to talk about your father, I've got good memories of the man. Sometimes that helps." "I'll keep that in mind," Ellen said, and watched him go. He came back the following week, and the week after that. Each time he bought something practical and said something small that managed, despite its smallness, to lodge itself in Ellen's mind and stay there. He told her about the time Thomas Rourke had talked a spooked herd back from a riverbank, crossing through nothing but patience and a steady voice. He told her about the night a storm hit the trail and her father had stayed awake through all of it without complaint, keeping watch while younger men slept. These were not large stories, but they were true, and they were generous, and Ellen found herself looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays, which were the days Louis seemed to come in most often, in a way she had not expected to look forward to anything. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn things about a careful person. He had grown up in Texas, in a county north of San Antonio. He had worked cattle drives starting at 16, and had done a stretch as a ranch hand for several outfits across Texas and New Mexico territory. He had fought briefly in a range dispute in Lincoln County 2 years prior, on the side that had generally been on the right of things, and had come away from it with a complicated feeling about violence that he did not articulate directly, but that she could hear in the spaces around what he said. He was currently working for a small cattle operation east of Red Mesa, run by a man named Dale Forsyth, doing general ranch work at the wage of $30 a month, which was honest money for honest labor. He did not tell her everything at once. He was not that kind of man. He parceled things out with a kind of natural economy, as though he had learned not to give more of himself than a situation called for, which was, Ellen thought, a thing that men who had been badly used by circumstance sometimes learned to do. She was not blind to the fact that she was beginning to like him considerably. She was also not in a position to do much about it, being a woman with no property, limited resources, and a pride that made accepting anything that resembled charity nearly impossible. So she kept things friendly and practical between them, and concentrated on the problem of her situation. Red Mesa in the autumn of 1878 was a town in flux. The Santa Fe Ring's land grabbing had created real bitterness among the small ranchers and farming families of Colfax County. There had already been the Lincoln County War to the south, which had ended badly for most of the people involved in it, and the political corruption that fed that conflict was the same corruption feeding the land transfers happening all around Ellen. She was not naive about any of this. She had listened to enough conversations in the dry goods store to understand that fighting Hector Crane through legal means was approximately as useful as arguing with the weather. The courts and the land offices were compromised. The political machinery of the territory was tangled up with the same interests that had taken her father's land, What she needed was something different. She did not yet know what it was. In November, Louis Sullivan came into the store on a Wednesday, which was unusual, and he did not buy anything. He stood at the counter and looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time since she had known him, not entirely composed. "I heard something today," he said. "What did you hear?" "Crane is looking to sell your father's land on. There's a buyer coming from Santa Fe the week after next, a man named Aldridge, developer type. He's looking to put a larger operation together out here, consolidate several smaller plots." He paused. "Once the land transfers to Aldridge, it'll be harder to do anything about it. The Santa Fe ring boys protect each other better when there's bigger money involved." Ellen set down the cloth she had been folding. "Why are you telling me this?" Louis was quiet for a moment. "Because it seems like something you should know." She looked at him directly. "What would you do if it were yours?" He held her gaze. "I'd find out exactly what the land is worth, and exactly what Crane paid for the debt note. And then I'd figure out if there was any way to put together enough to buy it back before Aldridge shows up. And if there wasn't enough—" He did not answer right away. "I'd find a way to get enough," he said finally, quietly, and then he left. Ellen stood in the store after he had gone, and she thought about what he had said, and she thought about what he had not said, and she thought about the particular quality of his voice when he said he would find a way, and something in her understood, before her mind had properly formed the thought, that Louis Sullivan was not simply sharing information. She told herself she was mistaken. She had been wrong before. Over the next several days, Ellen made inquiries. She talked to the land office clerk, a nervous young man named Pettigrew who owed Clara Finch a small personal debt, and was therefore disposed to be helpful to the women of the Finch household. She learned that her father's land, all 340 acres of it, had been purchased by Crane for the value of the outstanding debt note, which had been $218. The land itself, with its water access from the creek that ran along the eastern boundary and its good grazing pasture, was worth considerably more than that. Crane was asking $1,200 from Aldridge. $1,200 was a figure so far outside Ellen's reach that looking at it directly was almost funny. She had $11.40 to her name. She had a mule. She had a good strong back and a mind that Clara Finch had generously described as entirely too busy for its own good. She would not get $1,200 by Christmas. She would not get it by the following Christmas, working in a dry goods store. Louis Sullivan came in on Thursday as he usually did, and Ellen did not say anything about what she had learned, but she was quieter than usual, and her hands moved through the work of the store with a kind of suppressed energy that he seemed to notice. "Did you find out about the debt note?" he asked at the end of his visit. $218, she said. "Crane's selling for $1,200. He nodded slowly. "There's no way to buy it back," she said very evenly, very clearly. "I want you to know I understand that. I'm not asking anyone for anything." "I know you're not," Louis said. "I just wanted to say it plainly." "Understood," he said, and put his hat on and left. What Ellen did not know, and what she would not know for some time, was what Louis Sullivan did that same afternoon. He rode out to the Forsyth Ranch and had a conversation with Dale Forsyth that lasted the better part of an hour. Forsyth was a fair man, plain-spoken and straightforward, and he listened to what Louis said with the attentiveness of someone who respected the person talking to them. At the end of the conversation, Forsyth said that he had $400 he had been sitting on for the purchase of additional breeding stock, which he was willing to put toward the matter on the understanding that it would be repaid within 18 months at a modest rate of interest. Louis shook his hand and rode to town. He had, in his own savings, accumulated just over $600 over the better part of a decade of working cattle. It was everything he had. He kept it in a tin box under the floorboard of the bunkhouse because he did not entirely trust banks, and he had never spent it because he had been waiting, in the particular patient way of a man who does not quite believe the right moment will come, for a reason good enough to use it. He was aware that 600 and 400 made 1,000, and that 1,000 was not 1,200. He was also aware that the difference of $200 was not an insurmountable problem if you were willing to negotiate, and Louis Sullivan had been negotiating with ornery men in difficult situations since he was old enough to sit across a table from one. He went to see Hector Crane. This was not a comfortable meeting. Crane was not a physically imposing man, but he was accustomed to being the most powerful person in any given room, and he had a way of looking at people that was designed to communicate that he was doing them a favor simply by being present. He looked at Louis Sullivan the way he might look at a stray dog that had wandered onto his porch, with a mixture of mild curiosity and the readiness to have it removed. "I'm not here about the land on my own behalf," Louis said, settling into the chair across from Crane's desk without being invited to sit. "I'm representing a buyer." Crane raised an eyebrow. "You're a ranch hand." "I am. My buyer prefers to remain anonymous at this stage, which is not an unusual arrangement for this kind of transaction." Crane's expression shifted slightly toward interest, which Louis had been counting on. Men like Crane were always susceptible to the idea of a transaction that had an air of discretion about it. "The asking price is $1,200, Crane said, "which is a generous price for a small plot in a county where land values are uncertain," Louis said easily. "My buyer is prepared to offer 1,000 in cash to be settled before the end of the week. The man from Santa Fe is offering 1,200. The man from Santa Fe is coming from Santa Fe. He's not here yet. Cash in hand before the week is out, or you wait for a man who may or may not show with the full amount when he gets here." Louis leaned back slightly. "That's a risk calculation, Mr. Crane. I'm sure you're capable of making it." Crane looked at him for a long time. His fingers moved against the edge of his desk. 1,100, Crane said. Louis shook his head. "The offer is 1,000 cash before Friday." Another long silence. "Who's the buyer?" "Anonymous at this stage, as I said." Louis met Crane's eyes without blinking. "But they're serious and they're ready." Crane sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at Louis again. And then, in the way that men who have been presented with a clean, certain profit sometimes accept a lesser one over the uncertainty of a better one, he nodded. 1,000, he said, "before Friday, and the transfer is clean. No disputes, no coming back later with grievances." "Agreed," Louis said, and stood up and put his hat on. He went directly to the bank and arranged the transaction. He put together his 600 with Forsyth's 400 and handed over every dollar of it. He watched Crane sign the deed over. He watched the land office record the transfer. He collected the deed himself, a single folded document with the legal description of 340 acres in Colfax County, New Mexico Territory. He looked at the name on the deed before he left the land office. The transfer recorded the buyer as anonymous pending final designation, which the clerk had agreed to note as an administrative matter, and which Louis now corrected in the most direct way he could think of. He had the clerk write in the final line the name he had been turning over in his mind all day with a kind of quiet certainty that surprised him, because he was not usually a man given to certainty about anything quickly. Ellen Rourke. He had the clerk ink it in clean and proper. Ellen Rourke, owner, 340 acres, Colfax County, New Mexico Territory. He folded the deed and put it in the inside pocket of his coat and rode back to Red Mesa. He was not, in that moment, thinking clearly about what would happen next. He had been very focused on the doing of the thing and had not spent much thought on the consequences, which was perhaps a failure of planning, but was also, in its way, entirely characteristic of who he was. He acted on what was right and figured out the complications afterward. He left the deed on Ellen's kitchen table. This required a small logistical management, since he did not have access to Ellen's kitchen. But Clara Finch did, and Louis had become quietly acquainted with Clara Finch over the preceding weeks in a way that suggested she was not unaware of the shape of the situation between him and Ellen. When he explained to Clara, briefly and without embellishment, what he had done and what he needed. Clara Finch looked at him for a long time with an expression that combined deep approval with something that looked very much like the satisfied recognition of someone whose private guess has just been confirmed. "Leave it with me," Clara said. She put the deed on the kitchen table at the top of the stairs where Ellen would find it in the morning when she came down to start her day. Ellen found it. She sat down hard in her father's chair, which Clara had kept after Thomas Rourke's passing because it was a good solid chair and useful, and she did not stand up again for a very long time. She read the document 3 times. She read her own name on the document 3 times more. She sat with her hands flat on the table, and her heart making a complicated noise in her chest that she could not immediately categorize. Then she went downstairs and found Clara Finch and said, "Who did this?" Clara's expression told her everything before she said a word. "Louis Sullivan," Clara said. Ellen was quiet for a moment. "He bought my father's land back. He did, and he put it in my name. He did, without telling me." Clara reached out and put her hand over Ellen's. "I believe he thought it was yours to begin with," she said gently. "He was just correcting a mistake." Ellen went back upstairs. She sat with the deed for another hour. She was not crying exactly, but her eyes were doing something complicated and her breath was not entirely steady, and she allowed herself that much before she put the deed carefully in the inside of her good wool coat, the one she wore on Sundays, and pinned it flat against the lining. Then she went to find Louis Sullivan. She found him at the livery stable, which was where he went on Fridays after finishing the week's work at the Forsyth Ranch. He was brushing down his horse, a bay gelding named Copper, with the slow, methodical attention of a man who is doing something he has done 10,000 times and finds genuine peace in. He heard her come in and turned around, and his expression when he saw her was not what she expected. She had expected the expression of a man who had done something generous and was now waiting for gratitude. What she saw instead was something more uncertain, more careful, as though he was not sure what he had done would be received the way he had meant it, and that uncertainty made her chest do something she was not prepared for. "Clara told me," Ellen said. He nodded slowly. He put the brush down and turned to face her properly, and he did not say anything, which was, she was beginning to understand, his way of giving her the space to say whatever she needed to say first. "You spent your own money," she said. "Yes. Every last dollar you had saved." A pause, "plus some that Forsyth lent me. I'll work that off." Ellen looked at him steadily. "Louis, why?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because it was your land, it was your father's land. What Crane did was wrong, and I had the means to make it right, and so I did." "That is not a complete answer," Ellen said. He looked at her. The light in the livery was the yellow late afternoon light that came through the wide doors and lay in flat warm bars across the straw and the dirt, and it touched the side of his face in a way that made him look younger and less guarded than she had ever seen him. And Ellen Rourke, who was a practical woman and a sensible woman, and a woman who had not allowed herself to want anything beyond the necessary for 6 weeks of grief, felt something open in her chest like a door she had thought was sealed. "I know," he said quietly, "it's not." "Then what is?" He looked at his hat for a moment. He turned it over in his hands once, the habit of a man who is not comfortable with what he is about to say and needs something to do with his hands while he says it. "I've been coming to that store every few days for 6 weeks, he said. "And every time I walk through the door, everything about my day gets better. And I've been trying to figure out the right way to tell you that without making it sound like I'm asking for something in return for what I did, because I'm not. What I did because it was right, not because I wanted anything from you. I want you to know that clearly." "I know that," Ellen said softly. "That's how I know it's true." He looked up at her. "If you had done it to get something from me," she said, "you would have told me first. You would have made sure I knew it was you." Something moved across his face. "I didn't think about it that way," he said. "I just thought it was your name that should be on it." Ellen stepped closer to him, close enough that she could see the small details of his face. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw was set, the dark, careful eyes that were watching her with something that was trying very hard to be restrained and was not entirely succeeding. "Louis Sullivan," she said, "I have been waiting since the second week of October to say this, and I am going to say it now because I am tired of being practical." She paused. "I think you are the finest man I have ever met, and I think you have been in this store every few days for 6 weeks for the same reason I have been glad every single time you walked through the door. And I would like very much for you to stop treating me like someone who needs to be handled carefully and start treating me like someone you actually want to talk to." He stared at her for a moment that felt long and electric and entirely still. "I do want to talk to you," he said. "I want to do considerably more than talk to you." "Good," she said. "Then let's start." He smiled, and it transformed his face in a way she had not quite anticipated, because she had mostly seen him with the thoughtful seriousness he wore like a work coat, and the smile was something entirely different, warm and a little crooked and entirely genuine, and she was almost undone by it. "I don't have anything to offer you," he said, and she could hear that he meant it, that the vulnerability of it was real. "I put everything I had into that land. I've got my horse and my wages and a bunkhouse bed, that's all." "I have 340 acres, Ellen said. "You bought them for me. I think that counts for something between us. I don't want credit for it." "I'm not offering credit," she said. "I'm offering partnership." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "Ellen." "Yes." "Are you sure about this?" "Louis Sullivan," she said. "I am the most certain I have been about anything since my father died, and that is the truth." He reached out then and took her hand, which he held with a careful gentleness that was so at odds with the size and toughness of his hands that it made her want to press her face against his shoulder and stay there a while. She did not do that yet. But she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and somewhere in the warm, dusty light of the livery stable, a thing was settled between them that would hold for the rest of their lives. They walked out together into the last of the afternoon light. The weeks that followed were the most vivid of Ellen's life since before her father's illness. There was practical work to do, enormous amounts of it, and she threw herself into it with the energy of a woman who has finally been given a direction. The 340 acres needed everything. The fences Thomas Rourke had neglected in his last year of declining health, the small barn that wanted new siding, the house itself, which was still standing and structurally sound, but had suffered from 6 weeks of vacancy in a climate that did not forgive neglect. Louis came every day he could get away from the Forsyth ranch, which was most days, because Dale Forsyth was a decent man, and also because Forsyth had figured out what was happening between Louis and Ellen with approximately no difficulty at all, and had privately decided to be as accommodating as his own operation allowed. Louis worked alongside Ellen from early morning until the light failed, fixing and building and clearing, and they talked while they worked in the way that people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other and have the luxury of time and proximity. Freely, honestly, without agenda. She told him about her father. The real Thomas Rourke, not the version people eulogized. The stubborn, difficult man who had loved his daughter ferociously, and shown it mostly by teaching her to do things for herself, who had struggled with the debt he had accumulated in the bad drought years, and had been too proud to ask for help, who had spent the last years of his life watching his land slowly slip from under him, and had never quite recovered the heart he'd had before. She told Louis about the nights she had heard her father at the kitchen table long after she was supposed to be asleep, going over his papers with the particular quietness of a man who has arrived at a number that frightens him. Louis told her about his own father, a man who had not been steady or good, who had left the family in San Antonio when Louis was 12 and been seen occasionally afterward, but never depended on again. He told her about the way that loss had shaped him, the wariness that had become a habit, the difficulty of trusting that good things were not conditional on some payment he had not yet been asked for. He told her these things simply, without drama, with the even voice of a man who has had time to understand his own story but does not want to make too much of it. "You don't trust good things," Ellen said one evening, when they were sitting on the front step of the farmhouse watching the stars come out over the flat land. "I'm learning too," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. December came in cold and bright, the way New Mexico winters came, and the land had begun to look like something that could be a working farm again. They had mended the fence line. They had resided the barn. Ellen had moved back into the farmhouse, and Mrs. Finch had cried a small private tear and pressed a jar of preserves into her hands and told her she was always welcome back. Louis had begun spending evenings at the farmhouse in the way that gradually becomes understood without needing to be formally established. It was during a Sunday afternoon in early December, when Louis had come for supper, and they were sitting at the kitchen table after the dishes were done, that he said what he had been working toward for some time. "I need to tell you something about the Forsyth arrangement," he said. Ellen looked at him. "What about it? Dale's been good to me. I owe him $400 at a modest rate of interest, and I've been putting my wages toward it, but $30 a month with the interest." He looked at the table. "It's going to take a while." "I know arithmetic," Ellen said gently. "I'm not asking you to help with it." "I know that too." He looked at her. "I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I intend to pay what I owe from my own labor on my own terms. I won't come to you for money. But what I'm saying is that in the meantime, I can't offer you much by way of financial security, and I want to be honest about that because you deserve honesty." Ellen looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Louis, what is it you are actually trying to say?" He looked at the table. He looked at her. He picked up his coffee cup and put it back down without drinking from it. "I am trying to say," he said very carefully, "that I am in love with you, and that I want to ask you to marry me. And that I am aware I am doing so with approximately no material advantages to offer, and a debt I am still paying off and nothing but the labor of my hands and the plain fact that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worth it." The kitchen was very quiet. The wood in the stove ticked gently. Ellen Rourke stood up from her chair, walked the 3 steps around the corner of the table, put her hands on either side of Louis Sullivan's face, tilted his head up and kissed him. It was a long, warm, deliberate kiss, the kind that says several things at once without any of them being ambiguous. When she stepped back, he looked up at her with an expression that was, for the first time she could remember seeing, entirely open. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." "Louis Sullivan, I have been waiting for you to say that since November." "November," he repeated. "The day you came in on a Wednesday," she said. "When you told me about Crane and Aldridge, I knew then." He reached up and took hold of her hand where it rested against his jaw. "You might have said something." "You might have too," she pointed out. He laughed, and it was a full, warm sound that she had never heard from him in quite that way before, and she stored it away like something precious. They were married in Red Mesa on the last Saturday of February, 1879, in the church on the main street, with Dale Forsyth as Louis's witness and Clara Finch as Ellen's, and a congregation of about 40 people who had heard enough about the story of Thomas Rourke's land and Louis Sullivan's decision to fill the pews with a particular kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the heating stove. The ceremony was simple and spoken plainly, and when Louis put the ring on Ellen's finger, a plain silver band he had bought in Santa Fe on a day he had ridden there for the express purpose, she looked at him with so much feeling in her face that Clara Finch, who was a woman of considerable practical character, had to look away for a moment and collect herself. Ellen kept her name in the deed. She and Louis discussed it, and he was, as she had known he would be, completely without ego on the subject. "It was always your land," he said. "The deed should have your name. Mine is already on the other thing." "What other thing?" "The marriage record," he said with that small, crooked smile. "That's got both our names on it. I think that's enough." Spring of 1879 came in with intention, warm and green after a winter that had been harsh enough to test anyone's patience, and the Rourke land, which Ellen and Louis had quietly decided to call simply the Sullivan place among themselves, and the Rourke place with everyone else, began to respond to their work with the generosity that good land shows when it is properly attended. They ran a modest cattle operation, starting small with 12 head that Louis bought with the first 2 months of his wages after the Forsyth debt was finally cleared, which happened in October of 1879 after Dale Forsyth, in a characteristic act of practical generosity, agreed to count Louis's labor through the spring as partial payment in kind. Ellen managed the household accounts and the kitchen garden and the business correspondence with the natural aptitude of a woman who had always had a head for numbers, and she extended her reach into the practical management of the cattle operation in ways that Louis not only did not resist but actively welcomed, because he was a man secure enough in himself to recognize competence wherever it lived. They were happy in the particular way that people who have come to each other through difficulty are happy, not with the giddiness of people who have not yet tested the edges of things, but with the deep and grounded kind of happiness that comes from knowing the real weight of what you have and being grateful for every ounce of it. Colfax County, in 1879, was still a place of significant political and social tension. The Santa Fe ring's influence had not evaporated because the Lincoln County War had ended the year before. There were still men like Hector Crane operating in the territory, and the injustice of what had been done to families like the Rourkes was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of land speculation that had displaced many ordinary families, including a significant number of Hispanic families, whose land grants predated American territorial administration, and who had even less recourse against the lawyers and officials who moved against them. Ellen was aware of this in a way that was not theoretical. She saw it in the faces of her neighbors, in the conversations at church, in the careful way that certain families kept their legal documents close and their dealings with outside interests cautious. Louis, who had grown up in Texas during Reconstruction and had seen his share of systematic injustice applied to the people with the least power to resist it, shared Ellen's awareness without needing to be educated on it. They talked about these things as part of their regular conversation about the world, not with the helplessness of people overwhelmed by forces too large to touch, but with the attentive frustration of people who understood the mechanisms well enough to name them. What they did, practically, was focus on what they could control. They were good neighbors. They were fair in their dealings. When 2 families in their county lost their cattle to a disease outbreak in the summer of 1879, Louis rode out with what medicine they had on hand and spent 3 days helping manage the sick animals without charging for his time. When an elderly widower named Abelino Montoya, who farmed a small plot 2 miles east, needed help bringing in his harvest before a storm hit, Ellen organized the effort that got it done in a single day with the help of 6 neighboring families. These were not large gestures, but they accumulated into something real, which was the reputation of people who could be counted on, and in a county where trust had been systematically eroded by the machinery of corruption, that reputation was worth more than money. Hector Crane was not heard from again in any personal capacity. He moved his operations further north at some point in the following year, and Ellen heard from Clara Finch that he had been involved in a land dispute that had gone badly for him, which she received without particular satisfaction, but without grief either. In the autumn of 1879, Ellen discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Louis on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the calm matter-of-factness of a woman who has processed her own emotions privately before bringing information to the person she shares her life with. Louis, who was not a man who showed his feelings easily or often, sat very still for a moment. Then he stood up and came around the table and crouched down in front of her chair and took both her hands in his and looked up at her with an expression so unguarded that she felt tears push unexpectedly against the backs of her eyes. "Ellen," he said. "Yes," she said, "I know. Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said, "and I am very happy." He rested his forehead against her hands for a moment and she felt him breathe. Then he looked up at her again and she saw something in his face that she had not seen before, the expression of a man who has just understood that his life has arrived at the place he had stopped letting himself believe it would reach. "I'm going to be a father," he said, as though he needed to hear himself say it. "You are," she said. "Spring, I think. April or May." He stood and pulled her gently to her feet and held her with a care that was new and different and also entirely him, careful and thorough, and without any of the usual performance that men sometimes put around their tenderness. "I'm going to be very good at this," he said into her hair. "I'm going to do everything right." "You already do most things right," she said. "You'll figure out the rest." Their son was born in April 1880, in the farmhouse on a night when the spring storms were moving across the territory from the west, and the thunder was rolling in long, low waves that seemed to shake the air rather than break it. Clara Finch, who had come to stay the last week of the pregnancy because Ellen had refused to have any discussion about alternatives, was present for the labor, and so was the doctor from Red Mesa, a steady-handed man named Dr. Whalen, who had delivered half the children in Colfax County, and carried himself with the particular quietness of someone who has seen a great deal of the extremes of human experience and been made compassionate by it rather than indifferent. The labor was long and hard, as first labors often were, and Louis sat in the kitchen in a state of controlled anguish that Clara Finch recognized as a man's way of being afraid when the person he loves most in the world is beyond his ability to help. She brought him coffee and did not offer false comfort, which was the kind of respect that he appreciated. When the baby cried, Louis stood up so fast he knocked his chair back. "Doctor." Whalen opened the bedroom door and said, "You have a son. Both of them are well." Louis went past him into the room and to the side of the bed where Ellen lay, tired and flushed and holding a bundle that was making the small, agitated sounds of a person newly arrived in the world and not yet sure about the arrangement. She looked up at him and her face was exhausted and luminous and entirely her. "Come and meet him," she said. Louis sat on the edge of the bed. She put the baby into his arms with a careful competence that somehow still looked like grace, and he held his son for the first time with the same quality of attention he gave to everything important. Fully, without reservation, without anywhere else to be. The baby was red-faced and dark-haired and furious about the temperature of the room, and Louis looked at him with an expression that was so absolutely broken open and rebuilt that Ellen reached up and put her hand against Louis's face, and he turned toward her touch without looking away from the child. "Thomas," Ellen said. "I'd like to call him Thomas." Louis looked at her then. His throat moved. "After your father." "Yes," she said. "If you're willing." "I am very willing," he said quietly. "Thomas Sullivan." "Thomas Rourke Sullivan," she said. He nodded. Both their hands were on the baby now, and outside the spring storm was beginning to move east and the first clear stars were appearing at the edge of the retreating clouds, and the farmhouse on the Rourke land held the three of them in a circle of warm light while the rest of the county went about its nighttime business. Thomas Rourke Sullivan was a loud, hungry, emphatic baby who made his preferences known with the directness of someone who has studied both his parents and concluded that the direct approach is the one that works. He had Louis's dark eyes and Ellen's stubborn jaw and a personality that was entirely his own, interested in everything, tolerant of very little that he had decided was unnecessary, and absolutely committed to the people he loved. Louis was, as he had promised, very good at fatherhood. He was patient with the sleepless nights in a way that was not resignation but genuine willingness. He learned the specific language of the baby's various sounds and complaints faster than Ellen expected, and he attended to them with the same thoughtful attention he gave to every problem that came before him. He read to Thomas in the evenings, even when the baby was too young to understand the words, because Ellen had told him that her father had read to her from the time she was weeks old, and she had always believed it was part of why she had taken to language so easily. The cattle operation grew through 1880 and into 1881. Louis's instinct for cattle was good, and Ellen's management of the finances was careful and forward-thinking, and together they built a working ranch that was modest by the standards of the large operations in the territory, but solid by any other measure. They added 10 more head in the spring of 1881, hired a young Mexican man named Rodrigo as a part-time hand, and began the process of fencing the eastern pasture for year-round use. Rodrigo was 18, the son of a farming family whose land grant dispute was still making its way through the territorial courts in the particular endless, slow-grinding way that such disputes often moved, never quite resolved, never quite closed. Louis and Ellen were frank with each other about the limitations of what they could do about the systematic injustice of the territory's land policies, and equally frank about the obligation to be good and fair to the people in front of them. They paid Rodrigo a fair wage. They invited him to eat with them. When his family's case came up in a difficult month, Louis rode to Santa Fe with him to meet with a lawyer who had been recommended as someone willing to take difficult land grant cases. That particular case was not resolved quickly, as was the nature of such things, but the lawyer took it, and Rodrigo's family kept their land in the meantime, and that was what was possible, and they made sure it happened. In the summer of 1881, Clara Finch sold the dry goods store and moved to live with her sister in Colorado, and she came to the Sullivan place for a farewell supper that Ellen made into a full meal with everything she knew Clara loved, and they sat at the table long after Thomas had been put to bed and talked the way women talk when they are saying goodbye to someone who has been a genuine anchor in a difficult time. "You did well," Clara told Ellen at the end of the evening. "You both did well. We had help," Ellen said. "You had luck and Louis Sullivan," Clara said with characteristic directness. "Those are not quite the same thing, and you know it." Ellen smiled. "I know it." She walked Clara to her wagon and held her hand for a moment in the dark, and Clara squeezed back and then climbed up and drove away without looking back, which was also entirely Clara. The fall of 1881 brought a drought that was hard on most of the county. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the Rourke land held better than most water sources in the area, because Thomas Rourke had, in his better years, made thoughtful decisions about the land around it, and Ellen had extended that care. Their cattle came through the drought in fair condition. Several of their neighbors' herds did not, and Louis and Ellen opened the creek access to 3 neighboring families on the understanding that it was offered without strings and without a debt created. It was during this drought that Louis was approached by a man named Clive Durston, who ran the larger of the 2 ranching operations east of Red Mesa, and who had apparently concluded that the Sullivan place's water access made it worth acquiring. Durston was not, on the face of things, a dishonest man. But he was accustomed to getting what he wanted, and he came to the farm on a September afternoon and made an offer for the land that was, on paper, generous, and in practice, an attempt to consolidate. Ellen was in the kitchen when Durston rode up, and she stood at the window and watched Louis walk out to meet him and stand with the easy self-possession of a man who is on his own ground. She could not hear the conversation from the kitchen, but she watched its shape through the glass, and after about 10 minutes she saw Louis shake his head once, firmly, and then offer his hand in the final word way of someone ending a conversation rather than continuing it. Durston rode away. Louis came back inside and poured himself a glass of water and stood at the sink drinking it. "What did he offer?" Ellen asked. $1,500 for the full parcel. That's a fair price." "It's a fair price for land he wants because of the water," Louis said. "It's not a fair price for land that's someone's home and livelihood and history." He put the glass down. "I told him it wasn't for sale." "Without asking me," Ellen said. He turned. There was a flicker of something careful in his expression. "Do you want to sell?" "No," she said very clearly. "I just wanted to note that you could have asked." He nodded slowly. "You're right, I'm sorry." "Thank you," she said. "And also, thank you for saying no." He let out a breath that held a quiet humor in it. "Understood." She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him from behind, her face between his shoulder blades, and he covered her hands with his. "This is ours," she said. "It always was." "It always was," he agreed. In the spring of 1882, Ellen found out she was expecting again. She told Louis at the kitchen table again in the same matter-of-fact manner, and he responded in the same way. Standing, coming around the table, taking her hands, and looking at her with everything he felt for her entirely readable in his face. "A second chance to do better," he said. "You did extremely well the first time," Ellen said. "I don't know what you think needs improving." "I fell asleep at the kitchen table twice in the first month," he said. "Thomas was awake for most of both nights. You were entitled." He shook his head. "I want to be more awake this time." "Louis," she said, and waited until he looked at her properly. "You are the best father I have ever seen. I mean that. I measured you against my own father, who was a very good one, and you are just as good. I want you to know that clearly." He was quiet for a moment in the way he always was when something moved him past the point where he had easy words for it. Then he said, very simply, "Thank you." The second child was born in October 1882, a girl this time, and she came into the world faster and more efficiently than Thomas had, as though she had assessed the situation in advance and decided to approach it with practical dispatch. Dr. Whalen was there again, and Rodrigo's mother, a warm, capable woman named Graciela who had become a genuine friend to Ellen over the preceding year, assisted. Louis was allowed in the room this time, which he had requested with the diffident seriousness of a man asking for something he suspected might be refused, and had decided to ask for anyway. "Doctor." Whalen had agreed with a practical matter-of-factness that suggested he had made this accommodation before, and found it generally improved outcomes all around. Louis stood at the head of the bed and held Ellen's hand through the hard parts and did not faint or panic or make any demands on anyone's attention, which was, Graciela told him afterward, more than could be said for most husbands. He took it as the compliment it was meant to be. The girl was smaller than Thomas had been, with Ellen's coloring and Louis's eyes, and when Louis held her for the first time, she looked up at him with the absolute alertness of a newborn examining something she has decided is important. "She's looking at you like she's taking notes," Ellen said from the pillow. "Good," Louis said. "She should." They named her Margaret Clara, after Ellen's mother who had died when Ellen was 7, and after Clara Finch, who received a letter about it from Santa Fe and wrote back from Colorado with a warmth that was entirely authentic and a generosity that included a beautiful quilt she had apparently been making for the occasion since April. Thomas, who was 2.5 and had the social awareness of a child who has been much in the company of adults, accepted his sister with the considered interest of someone evaluating a new situation. He sat beside his father on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby for a long time and then said, with the careful pronunciation of a child working hard at language, "Very small." "She'll get bigger," Louis told him. "Like me?" "Just like you." Thomas appeared to find this satisfactory. The years moved in the way that good years move, full and purposeful and occasionally difficult and threaded through with moments that you recognize, even while they are happening, as the ones you will carry for the rest of your life. The ranch grew in a measured and deliberate way, never beyond what Louis and Ellen could manage well, and never at the cost of the quality they were determined to maintain. Rodrigo became a full-time hand and eventually a partner of a modest kind, with a stake in the operation that Louis had proposed, because it was fair, and that Ellen had immediately endorsed because she was not a woman who needed to be convinced of fairness. Red Mesa changed around them over the years, as small western towns changed. Some businesses came and went. A new school was established in 1883. The The railroad came within 12 miles of the county and changed the economics of cattle transport in ways that required several years of adjustment before the new pattern settled. The political situation in New Mexico Territory moved slowly toward statehood, which would not come until 1912, but which was a presence in the conversations of anyone paying attention. The Santa Fe Ring's influence diminished gradually over the course of the 1880s, partly through political pressure from reformers in Washington, partly through the sheer accumulation of its own internal contradictions. There were legal challenges and investigations that moved at the pace of territorial politics, which was slow and irregular, but they moved. Some men who had profited from the systematic dispossession of small farmers and ranchers faced consequences. Most did not. The land that had been taken from the people with the least power to keep it was mostly not returned. This was the specific injustice of the period, and no happy personal story resolved it, and Ellen and Louis were clear-eyed about that even as they celebrated what they had managed to hold and build. What they could do, they did. They testified when asked. They supported the legal efforts of their neighbors. They used the small weight of their good reputation in the county to argue for fairness in the land office and the courts. These were not large gestures on the scale of history, but they were genuine ones. Thomas grew into a serious, observant boy with his mother's intellectual intensity and his father's quiet physical competence. By the time he was 8, he was genuinely useful on the ranch, not in the exploitative way of children whose labor is taken from them, but in the way of a child who has been given real responsibility at a pace that matches his capacity and has found that responsibility satisfying. Margaret was 5 by then, and she had become a person of very considerable character. Loud, enthusiastic, certain of her opinions, and possessed of a warmth toward everyone she encountered that made adults who met her come away feeling inexplicably better about the day. Louis watched his children with a particular quality of attention that Ellen had come to recognize as the expression of a man who still sometimes could not entirely believe the life he had arrived at. She recognized it because she felt it herself. The farmhouse on the Rourke land, which had been a place of grief and vacancy in the autumn of 1878, was now so thoroughly full of life and noise and purpose that the walls seemed to hold a different quality of warmth than they had in those first empty weeks. One evening in the fall of 1885, when Thomas was 5 and Margaret was 3, and both children were finally asleep after a day that had tested the patience of everyone in the household, Ellen and Louis sat on the front step in the cooling air and looked out over the land in the particular comfortable silence that had been one of the great ongoing gifts of their life together. "I want to show you something," Louis said. She looked at him. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a folded piece of paper, which he handed to her. She opened it. It was a letter from a lawyer in Santa Fe, addressed to Louis, concerning a small parcel of land adjacent to their eastern boundary. A neighbor had passed the previous spring, leaving no direct heirs, and the land had been in probate since then. The lawyer was writing to inquire whether Louis and Ellen Sullivan had an interest in purchasing the 40 acres, as they were the adjacent landowners and the estate was motivated to settle quickly. 40 acres, Ellen said. Good pasture, Louis said. Water access off the same creek. Ellen looked at the letter. Then she looked at the land in front of them, the fence line they had built together, the barn with the new siding, the garden she had put in the year before, the familiar spread of the New Mexico sky above all of it. "What would it cost?" she asked. "Less than what we could manage if we tighten up this season." She folded the letter carefully. She turned to him and she studied his face for a moment with the attentiveness of a woman who has read this particular face for 7 years and knows every register of it. "Is this what you want?" she asked. "I want what you want," he said, "but yes, I think it's the right move." "Then we do it," she said. He took the letter back and put it in his coat. Then he reached over and took her hand in his, the same way he had taken her hand in the livery stable 7 years before, with the same careful gentleness that always surprised her slightly given the size and toughness of his hands. "Ellen," he said, "do you know what today is?" She thought about it. The date. The 7th of October. 7 years and 6 days from the morning she had found the deed on the kitchen table with her name written on it in his careful hand. 7 years, she said. 7 years ago I was a man with a tin box and an impulse and no particular plan past the doing of it, he said. And now, he looked at the land. He looked at the house. He looked at her. Now I have everything I never let myself want, he said, and I still wake up some mornings expecting to find out it's not real. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, his arm coming around her. It's real, she said. I'm very real. The children are extremely real as evidenced by the noise they made at dinner tonight, he laughed. The boy is going to be opinionated. He already is opinionated, he's 5. He told Rodrigo that the way he was fixing the fence post was wrong. Was it? A pause. A little, Louis admitted. The boy was right. Ellen smiled. The stars were coming out overhead in the enormous way they came out in New Mexico, big and immediate and close, and the night was quiet with the particular quality of a rural night that has real silence in it rather than the performed silence of a place that is only pretending to rest. "Louis," she said, "I love you." He pressed his lips against the top of her head. "I love you," he said, into her hair, quiet and certain and without any qualification at all. They sat on the step until the air got too cold and then they went inside together and the house held them. The following spring, Ellen found out she was pregnant for the 3rd time. She was 29 years old, Louis was 34, Thomas was 6 and Margaret was 4, and the ranch was in the best condition it had ever been. She told Louis at the kitchen table again, and he received it again with the same quality of feeling, which had not diminished through any of the preceding years. "3rd time," he said. "I have noticed that," she said, with the dry warmth that was one of the things he loved most about the way she talked. "Are you well?" "Very well, better than the first 2, honestly. I think I've gotten the hang of it." He shook his head at her, but he was smiling. "You make it sound like something you can just improve at with practice." "Most things are," she said. The 3rd child was born in November 1886, another boy, and they named him James, which had been Louis's grandfather's name, and which Louis had carried a private fondness for his entire life without ever expecting to use it. James came into the world with Thomas's dark hair and Margaret's emphatic volume, and a determination that made Dr. Whalen, who had now delivered all 3 Sullivan children, say that he would put money on this one being the one who caused the most trouble in about 12 years. He was not wrong. Thomas received his brother with the dignified interest of a 6-year-old who has already processed one sibling and knows the general shape of the situation. Margaret received her brother with an enthusiasm so intense that she had to be gently redirected from attempting to hold him immediately upon his arrival, which she had decided was non-negotiable, and had to be managed through the careful diplomacy of a parent who understood that Margaret's will, once engaged, was more efficiently navigated around than through. The house was full in a way that was loud and warm and occasionally overwhelming and entirely good. In the spring of 1887, Louis and Ellen completed the purchase of the adjacent 40 acres. The transaction was unremarkable compared to the one Louis had made in November of 1878, but it was in its own way significant. Done openly, with both their names on the deed, with savings they had built together and applied together to a decision they had made together. 380 acres now, in Colfax County, New Mexico Territory, with good water access and fair pasture, and a reputation in the county for being run with integrity. The deed went into the box with the other one, the original, the one that had started everything, the one with Ellen Rourke written in Louis's careful hand at a land office on a November afternoon, when a cowboy with $600 and a clear moral compass had decided that correcting a wrong was worth every dollar he had saved. Ellen had kept the original deed separate from everything else. It lived in the inside pocket of her good wool coat, which she wore on Sundays and on important occasions, and she had never moved it from there. Louis knew this because he had seen it there on the morning of their wedding and had understood what it meant without needing her to explain it. It meant, this is where it began. This is the thing that was done before it could possibly have been expected, the thing done with no audience and no reward and no certainty of any return, and I carry it because it is the truest thing I know about the person I married. He had never said this to her directly in those words. They knew each other well enough by then that they did not need to say every true thing directly in order for it to be understood. The summer of 1887 was one of the good ones, the kind of summer that a person living on the land in the American Southwest knows not to take for granted. Enough rain, not too much heat, the cattle in good condition, the garden producing well, the children old enough to be genuinely useful and young enough to find the daily work of the ranch an adventure rather than a burden. Thomas was 7 and took his work seriously. Margaret was 5 and took nothing seriously that she had decided was beneath her dignity, which was more things than you might expect. James was 9 months old and was primarily occupied with the project of pulling himself upright on anything he could reach, which was going well. Rodrigo had married a young woman from a neighboring family in 1886, and his wife Elena worked alongside him in a partnership that Louis and Ellen recognized with the satisfaction of people watching a familiar pattern repeat well. Their small house on the far edge of the property had been built by all of them together that previous autumn, and the 4 adults had developed the comfortable rhythm of neighboring families who have decided to take on the big problems together. It was in that summer, on a hot afternoon in July, that Ellen found Louis sitting at the kitchen table with both deeds in front of him. He did not hear her come in from the garden, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him. He was looking at the original deed, the one with her name on it, with an expression she had not seen on his face in a long time, the particular expression of a man looking at something that still surprises him. She came in and sat across from him, and he looked up. "Thinking about it," she said. "Sometimes I still can't believe I actually did it," he said. "I look at it and I think, that was the most reckless thing I ever did with money. And also the most certain." "Reckless is usually the wrong word for something you're certain about," she said. He turned the deed over in his hands. "I didn't know you," he said. "I mean, I knew you a little, 6 weeks of Tuesdays and Thursdays. I knew your father's stories about you. I knew what Crane had done was wrong." He paused. "But I didn't know you." Did it matter? He thought about it. "No," he said honestly. "It really didn't. The right thing to do would have been right whether I had ever met you or not." "That's why it meant so much," Ellen said gently. "You didn't do it to get something. You did it because it was right. And you were standing in the livery stable telling me you'd been in love with me since November," he said, with the slight wonder that he still sometimes showed when he touched the edges of the story. "I was telling you that you had been in love with me since November," she corrected. "I was in love with you from the Wednesday you came in to tell me about Crane and Aldridge, and I looked at your face and understood you were already planning something." He stared at her. "I don't think that's exactly what I said." "It's what you showed," she said simply. He set the deed down on the table between them. They both looked at it, the document that had started the whole thing, with her name on it in his hand from a moment before they were what they became to each other. "Ellen Rourke," he said, reading it. "Ellen Rourke Sullivan now," she said. "Both," he said. "The deed can say Rourke. The marriage record says Sullivan. You're both." She reached across the table and put her hand over the deed and over his hand where it rested beside it. "We're both," she said. "The land is Rourke. The family is Sullivan. And the story of how it happened belongs to both of us now." He turned his hand under hers and held it. The kitchen was warm, and the July afternoon light was coming through the window in long flat bars across the table, and outside they could hear Thomas's voice saying something serious and Margaret's voice answering him with some emphatic counterposition, and from the other room the sounds of James conducting his ongoing research into the structural properties of everything he could reach. "I have a good life," Louis said quietly. It was not a complicated statement. It was a factual one, said with the gravity of a man for whom the words were not easy and therefore exactly right. "We have a good life," Ellen said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the small private gesture that was one of his, that she had come to know as the way he said something he did not always put in words. She knew what it said. She knew it the way she knew everything about him by now, thoroughly and with gratitude, and without the need to name every detail because the knowing itself was the thing. The years settled around them like the land settled in a good season, with weight and warmth and the quiet certainty of things that have found their proper form. Thomas grew into a tall, serious young man who could work cattle with his father's economy of motion and reason through a problem with his mother's methodical precision, and who at 16 had already decided he wanted to study law, which Ellen received with enormous private satisfaction, and Louis received with the particular pride of a man who recognizes a quality in his child that is better than anything in himself. Margaret grew into a force of nature, who was managing the household accounts by 13, and had developed by 15 a business acumen that consistently surprised the adults who encountered it, particularly the ones who expected something different from a girl her age, an expectation she corrected without obvious effort, and with a cheerfulness that was more devastating than any argument. James grew into the good-natured troublemaker that Dr. Whalen had predicted, inventive, physical, permanently enthusiastic, and possessed of a gift for making people laugh that his mother said came from a part of the family tree she had not yet identified, and his father said was entirely natural to a child who had Margaret as a sister and had learned to find the humor in impossible situations early. In 1890, when Ellen was 34 and Louis was 39, they planted a new kitchen garden that was twice the size of the old one, and lined with the fruit trees that Ellen had been planning for 3 years and waiting for the right season to begin. They planted it together on a warm April morning, while the children were at school and Rodrigo and Elena were working the eastern pasture, and it was quiet except for the sound of the tools and the birds and the occasional distant sound of cattle, and they worked side by side in the way they did everything together, with the easy synchronization of two people who have spent enough time in the same space to move around each other without thinking. At a certain point, Ellen straightened up from the row she was working and shaded her eyes against the morning sun and looked at the land around her, the whole spread of it, the pasture and the barn and the house and the fence line they had built and rebuilt and the creek glinting in the east and the wide New Mexico sky above all of it. Louis, working a few feet away, noticed her stillness and straightened too. "All right," he said. She turned to look at him, and her face in that moment was something that he would remember for the rest of his life. The way the morning light was full on it, and the dirt on her hands and the tired happiness in her eyes, and the complete and absolute peace of a woman who is standing in exactly the place she is supposed to be. "More than all right," she said. He reached over and brushed the back of his hand against hers, soil against soil, and she caught his hand and held it, and they stood there for a moment in the middle of the half-planted garden with the whole morning around them. "You know," Ellen said, "I used to lie awake those first weeks at Clara's and try to imagine a version of this, some way that the land came back and things were all right again, but I could never get it to make sense. I couldn't see how it could possibly happen. And then you walked into the store and bought flour and coffee and a length of rope," she said, "and were polite and went away and came back and were polite again and went away again, and I thought, well, maybe the impossible thing is just going to happen one step at a time and not announce itself." He smiled. "That is usually how it works." "It is," she said. "Louis Sullivan, you were the best thing that happened to me in the worst year of my life, and you have been the best thing in every year since. And I want you to know that I am fully and completely aware of that and grateful for it every single day." He looked at her with everything he had ever felt for her entirely visible on his face, which was unusual enough, given his natural reserve, that it meant something particular. "I bought the land back," he said. You built everything else." "We built it," she said firmly. He shook his head. "You are the most stubborn woman in Colfax County." "And you are the finest man in it," she said, with the matter-of-fact warmth that was entirely her. "So we're well matched." He squeezed her hand once hard, and then they went back to the planting. The garden went in row by row under the April sun, and the fruit trees stood in their new places with the patient potential of things that will take years to show what they are, and the land held everything the way good land holds what is given to it, thoroughly, with the deep memory of soil that knows who has tended it. 380 acres in Colfax County, New Mexico Territory. One original deed with a woman's name on it, folded in the pocket of a wool coat. One family built from grief and generosity, and two people who had the particular courage of those who choose each other without calculation and without reservation. The deed still said Ellen Rourke. The land was still hers. And beside her, and with her, for every morning of every year that followed, was Louis Sullivan, the cowboy who had put every dollar he had into correcting a wrong because it was right, and who had given her back her father's land without asking for anything in return, and who had spent the rest of his life discovering, to his own quiet and genuine amazement, that a life built on that kind of beginning was one worth every difficulty it brought with it, and then some. The fruit trees grew. Thomas went to study law in Santa Fe at 20 and came back at 23 to open the first honest legal practice in Red Mesa, and spent his career doing what his parents had modeled, fighting for people who had the least power and the clearest right. Margaret took over the management of the Sullivan Ranch operation at 22 with a complete and unsurprising competence, and expanded it into something that was the envy and the model of every family operation in the county. James became a veterinarian, which surprised everyone and him the most, and served the county's farming and ranching families with the enthusiastic dedication that had characterized everything he did since he first pulled himself upright on the kitchen furniture. Rodrigo's family thrived. His land grant case was finally resolved, slowly and imperfectly as such things were, in 1891, with an outcome that was partial but real, and Louis and Ellen were there for the celebration with genuine gladness. Red Mesa grew and changed and eventually connected to the railroad, and then to the century that was coming, the 20th one, which would bring changes that the people of 1878 could not have imagined. But in the years that Ellen and Louis Sullivan had on the land they had fought for and built on and planted with fruit trees, and filled with children and neighbors, and the ordinary, extraordinary life of two people who had found each other in a hard season and held on, there was a completeness to things that asked for nothing more. On a Sunday evening in the fall of 1893, when the children were all nearly grown, and the ranch was running with the smooth efficiency of a 15-year enterprise, Ellen and Louis sat on the front step where they had sat 1,000 times before, in the cooling air, looking at the land. The original deed was in its place in the wool coat inside. The second deed was in the box. The trees in the kitchen garden were bearing their first real fruit. The cattle were in good condition in the eastern pasture. The house behind them was full of sound. Margaret's voice from inside, the scrape of a chair, the particular rhythm of a household that has been inhabited long enough to have its own music. "Louis," Ellen said, "are you happy?" He turned to look at her. The question was not between them a small one. They had each been through enough to know that happiness was not a default state or something that could be assumed. It was a real thing that required naming. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Genuinely and completely." "Good," she said. "So am I." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat in the evening light on the land that had been her father's and had been taken, and had been bought back by a man who barely knew her, and who had put her name on it because that was where her name belonged, and which had been the ground under everything since. The stars came out overhead, enormous and near, the way they came out in New Mexico, and the land was quiet, and the people who had tended it were at peace, and the story of how it had come to be was settled and whole and finished in the way that only truly good things are finished, not with an ending but with an arrival. They had arrived. They were home.